Hello dolls and hello dudes, welcome to another video. Today I'm doing something that has been highly requested. This is a little outside of the explaining 60s videos that I usually do because today we are gonna dive into 1960s men's fashion. I am truly excited to bring you this video. As said, this was really highly requested and I personally don't have that much knowledge on 1960s men's fashion, so I spent the last couple of days reading books, digging through old newspapers to bring you a pretty much complete history of 1960s fashion, all the different trends, all the different styles, and I'm truly excited to share all of this with you today. The 1960s marked a decade of significant transformation in men's fashion. 60s fashion, deeply influenced by the cultural shift, began with an extension of late 1950s styles before dramatically transitioning into the distinct 1960s style we all know and love. The change from polished suits to the bright colors and bold patterns encapsulates the radical evolution that occurred in men's fashion during this decade. The changes in fashion weren't merely for the style, they were deeply entrenched in the shifting societal and cultural landscape. The United States and United Kingdom significantly influenced these developments, with younger generations, particularly young men, driving innovative styles that challenged traditional norms. This youthful influence was instrumental in introducing an era defined by vibrant colors, bold patterns, and novel styles that would indelibly impact the trajectory of men's fashion. The 1960s were a decade that poignantly reflects societal paradigm shift through the lens of fashion. It was a time of dramatic transformation in men's fashion, spurred by various social, political, and cultural changes. These changes created diverse styles, from Ivy League to vibrant bohemian looks. These styles were more than just clothing. They were powerful reflections of an era. To be fully clear, quite a bit happened in the 1960s. Man landed on the moon, resulting in the space age craze, marking the decade. But indeed, an even bigger craze, Beatlemania, soon took the world by storm. Perhaps as a result of this, Americans in particular became obsessed with all things British. Everything from James Bond to bands like the Rolling Stones and the Kings were all the rage. When focusing specifically on clothing, the 60s were also home to several sartorial revolutions, perhaps the most important of them being called the Peacock Revolution. This new approach to fashion was characterized by bold colors, large patterns, and frankly, a few bizarre choices that are still beloved by many today. Still, men were freely expressing their artistic nature and their individuality through these clothing choices. This was something fully new in the 1960s. Up until the 60s, a lot of men didn't really care that much for fashion, but the 60s saw a huge growth in the fashion market for men, as men just became a lot more interested in fashion as a way of expressing themselves. Conventions of dressing were definitely being challenged, and artistic types like David Bowie were blurring the lines between what constituted men's and women's fashion. Essentially, as the 1960s went on, there was no real standard uniform anymore. More and more people started to wear what they liked whenever they liked. Be it formal, informal, trendy, traditional, conservative, or unconventional, it was all there. Stepping into the early 1960s, a time often described as the Mad Men era, a shift towards sartorial elegance marked men's fashion. The slim-fitting suit, crafted from the era's dominant fabric, gray flannel, was the cornerstone of this style. This was typically paired with either a crisp white dress shirt or a classic Oxford shirt. Skinny ties and narrow lapels further defined the look, reflecting the contemporary minimalist approach to fashion. Footwear also played a key element during this period, penny loafers and chukka boots being wildly popular. However, this was just one facet of the 1960s style spectrum, with the era also witnessing the emerge of diverse fashion trends, each with its cultural influences and statement-making aesthetics. From the rebellious beatnik style to the preppy Ivy League look, the vibrant mod style of London, and the laid-back surfer style from the coasts of California, the 1960s was a time of sartorial innovation and variety. The early 1960s, while still under the influence of the 1950s, bore the signature of the beatnik style. This trend was inspired by the Beat generation, post-World War II American writers, known for their anti-materialistic and somewhat cynical look. The beatnik style was not merely a fashion statement, but a social and political commentary that significantly influenced men's fashion in the early 1960s. The typical beatnik style included black turtleneck sweaters, berets, and dark sunglasses, symbolizing an enigmatic allure and a spirit of rebellion. The look was usually completed with slim trousers and pointed shoes, adding a touch of chic sophistication. The Ivy League style, popularized in the early 1960s, was a hit among college students and young professionals. This trend endorsed a clean, conservative look, inspired by the attire of Ivy League college students. The style included khaki pants, denim jeans, sport shirts, polo shirts, and button-down shirts. Popular Ivy League style pieces included the Harrington jacket, originally designed for golf, and the classic cable knit sweater. These items became popular for casual wear, contributing to the rise of the preppy look. Contrasting the Ivy League look was the mod style, born in London's Carnaby Street. This style, popular from the early 60s, featured slim-fitting, Italian-cut suits with narrow lapels, flat front trousers, and Chelsea boots. Bright, bold colors and psychedelic prints were key elements of the mod style. Carnaby Street had a significant influence on the mod style, with boutiques like John Stevens' His Clothes and Lord John's popularizing the avant-garde look. The modernists or mod style was wildly popularized by the Beatles, and truly was an outgrowth of the 1950s teddy boy styles. The mods of the 1960s were wearing Italian-styled cuts that featured jackets that were still a little bit on the boxy side, but trousers that were much more fitted than seen in 1950s suits. The philosophy here wasn't to rebel against tailoring or the traditional, but to embrace it and make it your own. These tighter-fitting suits were also accompanied by bolder colors and patterns. Polo shirts, turtlenecks, spear point collars, and tab collars soon rose to popularity among mods. A personal favorite of mine, fabric-covered buttons were also truly popular amongst mod, as well as Crumbie overcoats were seen a lot. And if you're wondering about mod accessories, think about a Vespa scooter with about as many mirrors and lights you could think of. Another popular style at the time was in many ways very contrary to the mods. The bohemian or flower power movement, as relaxed, eccentric, and carefree as it was the perfect uniform for the non-conformist. As said a couple of times in videos before, the line between hippie and bohemian style is often blurry, and when it comes to men's fashion, it is even harder to tell the two apart, as the overlapping was even greater. Popular wearers of this style included Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, and it soon rose to popularity among many young men rejecting societal norms. Hippie and bohemian fashion truly didn't see any rules when it came to fashion. Many wore denim and jeans with t-shirts, as made popular by James Dean a decade earlier. Tie-dye, funky button-downs, fringed jackets, and vests, and embroidered kaftans were favored by the hippie men of the 1960s. Still around from the 1950s were the so-called greasers, also called rockers from the UK. They listened to rock and roll and rode around on their motorcycles, usually wearing t-shirts, leather jackets, blue jeans, boots, or Converse sneakers. While it sounds kind of close to the hippies, this was truly a different style. While the hippies preferred fringed leather jackets and a lot of suedes, the rockers preferred simple white t-shirts and black leather jackets. The 1960s also saw the emergence of the skinheads or skins, a subculture which originated in the working class neighborhoods of London. While the skins got their names from their shaved heads, they were originally called hard mods, as an outgrowth of the mod movement and their rough behavior. There was quite a rivalry between the mods and the rockers on the streets of England, and every young man had to decide which side to join. Skinheads or skins were typically working class boys who couldn't afford expensive clothing and were frequently seen wearing clothes like Doc Marten boots and jeans with braces or suspenders, as well as button-down shirts. Coming from typically low-income areas, this style was born out of a desire for practicality. Many of these boys and men were working manual labor jobs, so the shaved head meant that their hair wouldn't get caught in the machinery. It also, however, had the added bonus of not being able to being pulled when getting into a fight. And of course, the 1960s was the apex of space age, so there was also a ton of futuristic and space-inspired looks around. Just like with the mods and hippies, I've already made a video on space age fashion before. I'm just gonna link all these videos for you because this is where I go a little more into detail about how space age fashion came to be. But just to add this here, space age fashion wasn't only popular among women. Many men loved shiny materials, silver pants, and the clean-cut, geometrical, futuristic looks that defined space age fashion. But as you probably know, fashion isn't always all you need. So let's talk about the elements outside of fashion that made the 1960s look. As far as facial hair is concerned, many men went clean-shaven, with occasional beards or longer sideburns seen. But again, because this was the decade of individuality, men could do more or less whatever they wanted. By the end of the decade, many men grew out their hair and beard for a return to a more natural, hippie-inspired look. As hair became a greater component of self-expression, and also for a couple of other reasons, head wearing wasn't as popular in the 1960s as it was in the decades before. After all, this was the decade where JFK famously went headless when giving his inauguration speech, resulting in many young men ditching the style too. So while heads weren't as popular as they were before, and they definitely weren't required anymore, a lot of men still really liked the look. And the dominant styles still were the fedora and the trilby. Overall, both of these styles were growing smaller, with narrower brims and shallower crowns. They were of course still really enjoyed by older men, with felt styles being worn during the cooler months and straw styles being worn during the summer. In an attempt to appeal to the younger generations and their various subcultures, hats started to be manufactured in different fabrics, colors, and patterns, including tweeds, cottons, plaids, herringbones, two-tones, and even suede and leather varieties. Trilby brims in particular were shaved down quite dramatically and angled quite severely as well in an attempt to be more fashionable. But this, along with the cheaper materials that these hats were being made from, led to a mass-produced, factory-made look and feel, which unfortunately still persists with the trilby, in particular to this day. Other headwear of the decade, of course, could be exemplified by the beatniks and hippies, using things like scarves as headbands, or wearing large oversized hats that they had often borrowed from their friends and girlfriends. Shirts in the 1960s were wild to say the least. Men were definitely wearing much more vibrant colors and patterns in their shirts than ever before. Indeed, shirts could come in pretty much any pattern imaginable, from narrow to white stripes, polka dots, checks, tartans, paisley, tiger skins, and leopard spots. There truly weren't any limits. Conversely though, solid black colors were also trendy at the time, and men increasingly tried to match their shirt exactly to other elements in their ensemble. Conventional shirts, polos, turtlenecks, and cardigan sweaters were all sold in coordinated colors. There were matching sets of shirts and socks, and even shirts with matching ties. 1960s shirts were now usually fitted and often tucked into the pants. In terms of collars, the point collar was still most popular, as opposed to other things like the rounded club collar, but the size of the collar could vary greatly. Everything from a small collar to an exceedingly large one was seen. For business, shirts were still more on the conservative side, in pastel colors and perhaps with small stripes or checks. But that's not to say that every man was always wearing a conventional button-up shirt to work now. And of course, the classic combination of a turtleneck and a blazer jacket was now seen in a lot of offices and still can be seen a lot today. Despite all the psychedelic colors of the 1960s, business suits surprisingly were still pretty conservative. The large shoulder pads of the 1940s and 50s were gone by this point, but men were still wearing jackets largely inspired by the 50s. The early 1960s suit was characterized by a 3-button jacket with rounded quarters and a high gorge, all popular style hallmarks of Italian tailoring. However, the Anglophilia I mentioned earlier also meant that by the mid-1960s, Americans were wearing classically British-inspired styles, with wider fits and country-inspired patterns. Still, there was a mix of multiple cultures here, as the shorter Italian-style jackets, playfully called bum freezers in the UK, also spread over to the US. Even today, Italian, British, and American tailoring styles are still battling it out. Also, the Ivy League style that I talked about earlier, which was established by students at elite American universities in the 1950s, in turn inspired by British styles of the 1920s, became popular in wider society in both Britain and America. Even in business settings, men could now commonly be seen wearing blazers and slacks instead of two-piece suits, and these jackets could feature bold patterns, including checks or white stripes. This was an outgrowth of the earlier rowing blazer, and indeed, jackets also featuring golden buttons were popular. However, all of these styles' hallmarks would begin to change by the mid-1960s. Essentially, young men were bored of the stuffy and dated ideals of masculinity that had been hanging around since the Victorian era. And in establishing their own identities, looked to subvert these societal rules and perhaps even the idea of masculinity itself. As mentioned before, many pieces of clothing would blur the lines between genders and overall take on a more unisex style. In addition to wild colors and patterns, things like velvet and frills would become increasingly more common for men too. Fashion boutiques in London, such as Mr. Fish and Blades, would marry the old style with new, crossing Western fashion with cultures from around the world and providing a new spark in tailoring. This led to a huge variety of unique garments. There are just too many to list here, but to give you a taste, silk and velvet trousers and jackets, rainbow striped suits and coats, zip-up jackets, jackets without collars or lapels, double-breasted jackets with huge lapels, leather jackets, and narrow jackets were usually bestsellers in these kind of shops. So while many men were still wearing traditionally styled clothing, at this point it was becoming more colorful and eccentric. By the end of the 1960s, many were troubled by the violence that they had seen from the Vietnam War, as well as the other social struggles of the time. So they were becoming more ethically minded and less consumerist overall. This led to a renewed interest in antique and vintage fashion, focusing on making the most of what was already available rather than chasing the next new thing. So the late 60s in many ways truly was the beginning of the vintage fashion movement. So if you're wondering why many of the good condition vintage clothes can be so expensive these days, it's because a majority of it was bought in the 1960s and 70s by shop owners who would travel door to door and offer people money on the spot for their old clothes. These were then preserved, sold on and over again, and some of them are still around today. This is when people really began hunting for 20s, 30s, 40s, and even Edwardian and Victorian styles. Just last week, I made a full video all about the medieval revival. I'm gonna link that here in case you want to see it. But just as a little example here, think about frog pockets, originally a trend that went out with the Edwardians, making a return on some 1960s trousers. Frog pockets are characterized by sitting diagonally across the hip rather than being made part of the side seam. Speaking of trousers though, let's take a look at what was typically seen on a 60s men's legs. The trousers of the 1960s were famously tight-fitting, especially in the hips and the upper thigh. Thanks to this fittedness, pleats were no longer on trend. Speaking of trouser trends, bell bottoms, which flared at the bottom, sometimes wildly, and usually touched the ground, became wildly popular in the mid to late 1960s. For the mod business style though, trousers were typically just cut straight at various widths. The most important change of trousers in the 1960s, mostly because it is still felt today, was the lowering of where the trousers sat on the body. Inspired in part by the countercultural movement of wearing jeans, which formerly was pretty much only workwear and was now seen as casual wear too, many fashion houses decided to lower the waist to sit at the hips rather than the natural waist. This was a really big revolution coming from the dress pants of the 1950s that always sat right on top of the belly button. Suit trousers didn't get quite as low as denim went, but it was definitely now worn below the belly button. Many trousers at this point were usually worn with belts instead of suspenders, but the fashionably minded would opt for side adjusters instead. And just like jackets, trousers could also come in a variety of wild and wonderful patterns and colors. These were casual fashions and not typically worn in business or a traditional environment. To complete the 1960s suit look, ties went on a little bit of a revolution themselves. The beginning of the 1960s saw very skinny ties, which were often knitted. These were very much within the mod school of thought and came in pastel colors, flecked patterns, and stripes among others. Essentially, they were holdovers from the late 1950s. Unlike the 1950s though, most ties in the 60s were tipped. Previously, tipping ties had been a lot more expensive, but with new and cheaper fabrics, as well as cheaper methods of production, it now became more inexpensive to tip the tie than to even leave them untipped. This also meant that most ties now were fully lined but made from 100% polyester. I feel like many people nowadays really look down on polyester as a cheap synthetic material, but that's not really all it is. See, while polyester is a synthetic material, it is actually great for a couple of things, especially outerwear. Polyester truly can give different pieces different shapes and forms. That's mainly because it comes in different fabric structures, from very fine ones to larger fabric structures, which is what usually gives the clothing the hold and also is great for outerwear pieces. The only issue with polyester really is if you wear it on your skin. That's why a lot of people experience the sweating and they just kind of find it uncomfortable. So if you have polyester pieces that you love, but you don't love the feel of wearing them, I would highly recommend you to try layering them over something made from a natural material like cotton, linen, or silk. It'll feel completely different and maybe it'll make you fall back in love with some of your polyester pieces. By the mid-1960s, fashionable young Londoners were challenging the state rules of masculine etiquette that had been around since the Victorian times. Circulating in the overlapping world of fashion, music, the newly influential media, and high society, the modern dandy, unashamed to wear frills, velvet, and other elements, previously judged to be too feminine for a man, started to appear. A group of entrepreneurs capitalized on this shift in taste, setting up shops that married traditional tailoring techniques with the design flair of graduates from recently established menswear courses. Particularly influential men's fashion boutiques included Hung on You in the King's Road, Blades in Dover Street, and Granny Takes a Trip also on the King's Road. Designer Michael Fish was a stylist in fashion and film before opening Mr. Fish on London's Clifford Street in 1966. Here he sold a range of so-called peacock styles that made no apology for being highly individual. White ties, colorful suits, and separates influenced by other cultures. I am actually thinking about making a separate video all about the dandy fashion and the Peacock Revolution of the 1960s, so please just let me know if you would like to see that. Men were increasingly wearing their shirt collars open, in a more casual style, so scarves became popular once again, as did cravats and ascots. Scarves and neckties could be worn with neck rings, which was a revival of 100-year-old fashion, meaning that the 1860s style of the neck ring had come full circle. So let's talk about shoes. The go-to shoe for many men in the 1960s was the Chelsea boot. Originally created in 1837 by the shoemaker for Queen Victoria, it experienced a renaissance in the 1960s. Originally called paddock boots, they were easy to get on and off because they featured no lacing, but rather elastic rubber gussets on either side. The Chelsea boots of the 1960s were much more modern looking and popularized by, of course, the Beatles. This made them arguably the most popular shoe style of the 1960s, especially among the mods. As for the new name of the style, Chelsea was an area of West London that by the 1960s was home to many painters, actors, artists, and socialites. They were collectively known as the Chelsea set, and fashion boutiques catering to their tastes popped up in this area. Because many of these individuals started to wear the paddock boot again, it came to bear the new name of the Chelsea boot. Another phenomenon of 1960s footwear was the so-called Cuban heel, a straight heel of medium height that when put onto a man's shoes appears to be higher by comparison. Taller heels like this got their start to aid with getting on and off of horses and to provide more stability when walking. They were popularized to worldwide acclaim by, of course, the Beatles. I think it is truly important to note here how the Beatles influenced 1960s men's fashion. Basically, whatever the Beatles wore, men all across Britain, the US, and soon all across the world would start to wear. In the beginning of the 1960s and the Beatles' career, when they were really clean cut, the mod style was truly popular. And as they progressed into a more bohemian, hippie style by the end of the decade, many of their fans followed. Whatever the Beatles wore was an instant trend in menswear in the 1960s. The Beatles actually started to commission their Chelsea boots with Cuban heels, and the fashion spread like wildfire, making this shoe still known today as the Beatle boot. Other shoes of note in the 1960s were monk strap shoes, suede shoes and boots, sneakers, cowboy boots, and tasseled loafers. Following on from the 1950s, the 1960s saw an explosion of subcultures, rebellious youth, and popularized fashion ideals and styles. There were many wild styles, of course, especially after the Peacock Revolution. The 1960s were a decade that saw more men getting interested in fashion as a way of expressing themselves. Many fell in love with the patterns, styles, and fabrics all of a sudden available in the 1960s. And fashion sales among men rose substantially. The anything goes spirit of the 1960s inspired many men to express themselves, from avant-garde styles to laid-back hippie looks, and still inspires many men up until today. So that is it for today's video. This is probably going to be a rather long one, but I just wanted to include all of these different elements because the 1960s were a decade that just saw so many different styles being popular among men. I really hope you enjoyed this. This is an area that I don't have as much expertise in as I do have in 1960s female style, but I really enjoyed digging deep through all the old articles to bring you this collection of 1960s popular style among men. As always, I have a Pinterest board linked down below with all the pictures that I used for this video, so make sure to head over there if you want to take a closer look at any of these styles. Also, please leave a comment down below telling me if you're interested in me covering more men's fashion. As said, it is something I'm not as familiar with as female styles, but it's also something that I quite enjoyed getting into for this video. I want to thank you for watching and spending time with me today. I really enjoyed making this video and I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you enjoyed what you saw, I would love for you to give it a thumbs up and maybe even share it with a friend. Maybe you have a male friend who is into the 60s, so maybe share this video with them. And consider subscribing. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, everybody!